Book of Ezekiel, Part 4. Ezekiel, chapter 19, verses 1 to 14. The allegory of the lions, allegory of the vine branch, the tragic end of the princely offspring of a lioness, that is, verse 2 to 9, and of a vine, verse 10 to 14, is told in two allegorical lamentations. The subject of the first lament is the exile of the two royal lion cubs of Judah, one to Egypt and the other to Babylon. Since only one king contemporary with Ezekiel was taken captive to Egypt, the identity of the first lion cub, verse 3 to 4, is unquestionably Jehoazaz, the son of the queen Hamatal and King Josiah. Only after 3 months' reign in 609 BCE, Ahaz was taken captive by Pharaoh Necho and deported to Egypt, where he died in 2 Kings chapter 23, verse 30 to 34. The identity of the second lion cub, verse 5 to 9, is more difficult since two kings contemporary with Ezekiel were taken captive to Babylon. If the same mother lion was to both the cubs, and the second queen is Queen Hamutah's son Zedekiah in 2 King chapter 23 verse 31, chapter 24 verse 18, who were taken captive by Nebuchadnezzar in 587 BCE, blinded and led to change to Babylon in 2 Kings chapter 24 verse 18 to chapter 25 verse 7. If however the mother lion is a metaphor for Judah, comparing in Genesis chapter 49 verse 9, from whom many princes emerged, then the second king might well be Jehoiachin, the son of Queen Nehushta, who after a 3 month reign in Jerusalem was led captive to Babylon in 597 BC and kept prisoner by Nebuchadnezzar in 2 Kings chapter 24 verses 8 to 15. The subject of the second lament, that is verses 10 to 14, the annihilation of Zedekiah when we compare it with chapters 17 and 31 and the mother vine. This allegory tells how the vine and its strongest stem were plucked up, exposed to the weather and burned in verse 12. In those days, Babylon was religious branch of Babylon in chapter 17, and there's a commercial branch of Babylon in chapter 18. Then transplanted to a desert land, that is taken to Babylon in Jeremiah 52 verses 1 to 11. This one stately vine had no branches and no fruit. The strength of the royal vine was destroyed in verse 14. The fate of Judah's royalty is thus the subject of mourning and lamentation in verse 1 and 14. The two historical allegories in chapter 19 are both the dirges in 5-bit lament meter. Three beats followed by two give the poem a limping and a halting rhythm in Hebrew when we compare it to 2 Samuel chapter 1 verse 17 to 21, Isaiah chapter 14 verses 4 to 20, and Amos chapter 5 verses 1 to 3. Form as well as the content effectively show that for Ezekiel, nationalist hope in the Davidic line was virtually dead. Ezekiel 20 verses 1 to 44 is Israel's history of infidelity. The chapter 20 opens with a specific date and presents a familiar scene of certain elders of Judah who gathered at the Ezekiel's house when we compare it with chapter 8 verse 1 and chapter 14 verse 1. The exile come to ask Ezekiel to inquire of the Lord for them, as in chapter 14, so to here following the revelation formula in chapter verse 2, God questions whether the elder should be permitted to seek an oracle in verse 3. Instead of oracle, Ezekiel is charged to deliver a jarring historical retrospective in verses 4 to 31 that underscores the sinfulness of the chosen people from the very beginning in Egypt, verses 5 to 9. Through the rebellious first generation, verses 10 to 17, the second generation, verses 18 to 26 in the wilderness, and even to the present generation, verses 27 to 31, all have profaned God by doing after idols. So therefore the verses 7, 16, 18, 24, 30 and 31. Israel can take no pleasure in its and delights in its past. As Ezekiel tells the story, there never was a time of right relationship between God and the people when you compare the more usual interpretation that once the people entered the land of Canaan, the syncretism caused a strain in their relationship with God. For Ezekiel claims that from the moment of the Exodus onward, there have been disharmony between God and the idolatrous chosen people. For the first time, the book of Ezekiel presents the important theological rationale that is further developed in chapters of 36 and 39, that God has extended mercy to the people not for their own sake but for the sake of the holiness of the divine nature in verses 9, 14, 22 and 39. That is the mercy of God. Deliverance is inextricably bound to God's holiness, reputation, character in the world. And now at the conclusion of the historic account, to be true to the divine identity and presence, God refuses an oracle to the idolatrous elders who come in verse 31. So there are 12 tribes and no message for them, since all the in the course of the historical recitation, Ezekiel speaks of statutes given by God that were not good in verse 25, laws that contribute to the defilement of those who sacrifice their firstborn to God, that is verse 26, and compare Exodus chapter 22 verses 28-29. Retribution seemingly takes the form of God's misleading the people, though or more ordinarily understood as a light of guidance in Psalms 119 verses 105 is here a cause for stumbling. God deals perversely with the rebellious people when we compare with Psalm 18 verse 26 as a mysterious, incomprehensible judge. A disputation, that is verses 32 to 44 following the historical recitation, reiterates the charge that the present generation is idolatrous. In his first section, that is verses 32 to 30, God promises harsh treatment for those who serve wood and stone in verse 32. As a wrathful king in verse 30, God will assemble the exile and lead them to desert in a new exodus in verse 34 for a severe face-to-face judgment, verse 35, comparing in-person encounter promised to the idolaters in chapter 14 verse 4. Like a shepherd, the Lord will use a staff to count out the small number of faithful people from the rebellious one. The transgressor will never again be permitted to return to the land of Israel in verses 37 to 38. Thus God promises exile will know the Lord. That is recognition in verses 38. The dispute then continues with a word to the members of the house of Israel, urging them to put away all idols in verses 39 to 44. Authentic worship requires complete awareness and renunciation of the past evil conduct and action. An unexpected word of genuine hope mitigates the severe judgment. God promises to bring Israel back into the land to receive the offerings of the people and to accept their repentance in verses 40 to 44. By such means, the mystery of God's holy name will be made manifest to the nation. Restoration will bring with it true recognition of God, as mentioned in verses 42 and 44. Ezekiel chapter 21 verses 1 to 10, the sword of the Lord. In chapter 21, Ezekiel's words grows most strengthened as he earns that the sword of the destruction is unsheathed and ready to be striking. The prophet is instructed to deliver an allegory against the forest of the south, stating that God is kindling a fire that will devour all the trees in verses 2 to 4. Ezekiel protests that the people mock him when he speaks in parables, verses 5. So he is given an interpretation of the allegory to proclaim in verses 6 to 10. God is coming with an unsheathed sword that will not be sheathed again to destroy the wicked and the virtuous of Jerusalem. He is ready for war. In Ezekiel chapter 21 verses 11 to 12, there is an act symbolic of the city's fall. As in chapter 6 verses 11 and chapter 9 verses 8 and chapter 11 verses 13, the prophet expresses grief over the coming suffering of the people. He is instructed groan with deep emotional sadness as a sign that the end has come. Ezekiel chapter 21 verses 15 to 22, the song of the sword. Ezekiel engages in a kind of a sword dance. He sings a song about a shepherd ready sword of destruction in verses 14-15 and performs a number of symbolic actions in verses 16 to 22. He cries aloud and slaps his thigh in verses 17, claps his hand verses 19, brandishes the sword to the right and to the left in verses 21. He announces that the sword has been put in the hand of an unidentified slayer in verse 16 and that God approves him in the verses 22. God the divine warrior will execute fierce judgment against the people, not for them. Ezekiel chapter 21 verses 23 to 32, Nebuchadnezzar at the crossroads. He's ready to attack. Okay, he's already planned and he's coming. Next, Ezekiel is instructed to draw a map indicating two possible paths from Babylon, chapter 21 verses 23 to 28, one leading to Rabbah in Ammon, the modern city of Ammon in Jordan, and the other to Jerusalem, which is symbolic acts in chapter 3 verses 16 and chapter 5 verses 17. In 587 BC, these two small nations joined in alliance against the threatening power of the Babylonian Empire in verse 26 by three methods of divination: shaking marked arrows and drawing one by lot and consulting teraphim, which were small images of household gods, and interpreting markings on the entrails of a sacrificed victim. Though the people may wish to dismiss this warning, their fate is marked by the arrow in Nebu's hand, that is marked by verse 28. So thus Zedekiah is addressed as a depraved and a wicked prince whose end is coming in verses 29 to 32. A triple reputation, twisted will I leave it, in verse 32 expresses the utter chaos about to befall in the city, the utter destruction. The sign is thus made clear that Jerusalem and its ruler are doomed to destruction. Ezekiel chapter 21 verses 33 to 35 5 to 37 against the Ammonites. In this difficult passage, which may come from a later period, the Ammonites are depicted as wielding a sword against Israel in verses 33 to 34. God stays their hand in verse 35, declares that these people will themselves be judged and destroyed in verse 36. So complete will be their destruction that they will no longer be remembered in verse 37. So worse punishment that this could not be imagined. Ezekiel chapter 22 verses 1 to 31, crimes of Jerusalem. Three oracles on the coming theme of the defilement of Jerusalem have been grouped together in this chapter 22. The verses 1 to 16 attack the violence and the idolatry of the bloody city, and notice the sevenfold repetition of the word blood and bloodshed in verses 2, 3, 4, 6, 9, 12, and 13. In verses 70 to 22 describes Israel as a scrap metal of no value. Verses 23 to 31 condemn the princes. Verses 25, priests verses 26, nobles verses 27, prophets 28, that is false prophets, and people of the land verses 29 who have turned to sinful ways. These are the crimes and sins of the people. Destruction of Jerusalem inevitable given the universal corruption of the city. When we compare with Zephaniah chapter 3 verses 1 to 8, God's ways are final. The judgment is coming on all and common as well as individuals. During the time of David, there was one king, Solomon. The kingdom broke into north and south, but they did not learn from their past mistake. Ezekiel chapter 23, verses 1 to 49, the two sisters. In this chapter, the prophet concludes his green picture of Israel's past when we see chapter 14, verses 12 to chapter 23, verses 49, using the coarsest language found in the prophetic literature. God tells Ezekiel an allegory about the north, Israel and Judah, portraying the two nations as harlots, and he compared it with chapter 16, who seek to outdo one another in their sins. In verses 1 to 4, they introduce the two sisters tale of their immoral childhood in Egypt despite their sins. Lola, that is Samaria, and Ololiba, that is Jerusalem, were taken as bride by the Lord and bore many sons and daughters. So the names of the two woes can be translated as she has who has her own tent, and Ohola, and my tent is in her, Oholiba. Since the tent was a place of meeting with God in the wilderness, in Exodus chapter 33 verses 7, the names can be cultic illusions. So thus another possibility, the words are simply sound like alike names with a foreign flavor. Israel is the chosen people. God still is powerful and loves them. Allowing children to get married to outsiders like Hosea's wife is a symbolic act. And though the meaning of the names is now obscure, the symbolism of the two harlot sister cities wed to God as representatives of Samaria, the capital of Israel, and Jerusalem, the capital of Judah, is clear. The verses 5 to 10 describe the depravity and the punishment of the older sister, Oholah, Samaria, who offered herself to Assyrian lovers. And verses 11 to 21 describe even more vile harlotry of Oholiba, Jerusalem, who made open advances to Assyria and Babylonia. In four divine sayings, that is verses 22 to 35, each introduced by the formula, thus says the Lord God, verses 22, 28, 32, and 35, God declares that on account of their sin, Jerusalem will be punished. Original to the text is the judgment that Jerusalem will be handed over to her lovers who will now unleash violence against her. They will mutilate her body so horribly she will never again be able to play the harlot. In verse 25, cutting off her nose and ears, a punishment found both in Egyptian and Assyrian texts. Most likely, the secondary to the text are verses 28 to 34, which state that Jerusalem will be handed over to those who she hates. That is verses 28 to 30, and then she'll be judged by sharing her sister's cup of dismay in verses 31 to 34, verses 36 to 49. A later retelling of the allegory of the Oholah and Oholiba summarizes sins of the sisters in verses 36 to 44 and describe their punishment in verses 45 to 49. The women's sin simultaneously will be punished simultaneously. Added here is a warning to individual women not to imitate the lewdness of the two sisters in verses 48. Finally, recognition formula appears, signaling that judgment is an experience through which God's sovereignty will be known in verse 49. Ezekiel chapter 24 verses 1 to 14 is the allegory of the pot. The siege of Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, began on the 10th day of the 10th month in the 9th year of the Jehoiachin's captivity. That is verse 1. Also see 2 Kings chapter 25 verse 1. On this very day, which would have fallen towards the end of the year 588, Ezekiel, who was in Babylon, was commanded to write down the date and deliver an allegorical oracle to the rebellious people in verse 1 to 2. Ezekiel describes the coming fate of those left behind in the city of Jerusalem, a description of an unclean and rusty cooking pot in verses 3 to 14. God avenges the crimes of the city and its inhabitants in a fire that consumed not only the contents of the pot but the pot itself. God had wished to spare the city, but now the end has come and no one needs hope, for God will not relent. Ezekiel chapter 24 verses 15 to 21, 24, 22 to 23. Symbol of the destruction of the temple. Since Jerusalem temple fell in the summer of 587 BCE, God's shocking word to Ezekiel is this passage probably took place sometime after the preceding dated allegory in verses 1 to 14. The prophet is told that his wife, who is the delight of his eyes in the verse 16, will suddenly be taken from him, and that he is not to mourn her death publicly in verse 17. Ezekiel proclaims this strange message to the people, and on the evening of the same day, verse 18, his wife dies just as the Lord had said. People ask for an explanation of these strange acts from the prophet, verse 19, who proclaims that the death of his wife is a sign of the death of Jerusalem. As he has been commanded not to be with the loss of his beloved, so too must the people not be with destruction of their delight and their desire, the sanctuary of Jerusalem, in verses 20 to 24. Ezekiel chapter 24 verses 25 to 27, end of Ezekiel's dumbness. It appears that Ezekiel neither laments his wife's death nor speaks at all until the word reaches him that the city has fallen. Most likely an editor added these words to relate the preceding passage about the destruction of Jerusalem to chapter 33 verse 21, in which a fugitive from Jerusalem, first mentioned in chapter 24 verse 26, arrives in Babylon to announce the holy city has been taken over. As the text now stands, chapters 25 to 32 have been inserted between these two significant passages about the fate of Jerusalem when we compare it with chapter 24 verse 26 and chapter 33 verse 21.